Mr. President, it's Thursday afternoon, and time I love to come down on the floor. One of my favorite times of the week, because I get to talk about an Alaskan who has done something really, really important for their community, or their state, or their country. And I know the pages like the speech, because I talk about stories in Alaska, the great state of Alaska, what's happening in the state right now. Sometimes I call this person the Alaskan of the week. Usually it's one person. Sometimes we fudge a little and recognize more than one person. So today we're going to recognize our Alaskans of the week. In any case, these are people who help their communities, help their country, oftentimes do something that's unheralded, nobody knows about, very few know about. So I like to come down and tell the country about what they're doing. And as you know, Mr. President, Alaska's a big state, holds a lot of imagination for our nation, the last frontier, with good reason, because we're filled with resilient people, some who have lived in Alaska for thousands and thousands of years, building communities in some of the most extreme weather environments on the planet. And they're tough, my constituents. But they're also kind, and they make it through our tough winters. It's below zero in many, many parts of the state, well below zero. We make it through these winters through toughness, ingenuity, and, importantly, looking out for one another. Mr. President, last week I highlighted a heroic Coast Guard rescuer, Evan Grills, in a real epic story for those who listened to it, what this young scout swimmer, rescue swimmer did in his first mission ever in the Coast Guard. Something that people should remember for a long, long time. And this week, I'm going to talk about another rescue mission, an only in Alaska mission. And I'm going to recognize 4 extraordinary young Alaskans who stuck together, toughed it out, looked out for one another, and were rescued in another perilous situation. This is Christopher Johnson, age 14, Frank Johnson, age 8, Ethan Camille, age 7, and Trey Camille, 2 years old. All of them are alive and recovering because of their own ingenuity, determination, and toughness, and looking out for one another. These 4 boys are from Nunam, Iqua, a Yupik village 495 miles northwest of Anchorage. Home to about 200 people, this village is a close-knit Yupik community on the South Fork of the Yukon River. A 2005 mission statement written by the community leaders and elders describes the village like this: a small, quiet community of family, relatives, friends, working together to pursue our Yupik way of lifestyle with respect to our surrounding land and waters for subsistence. Like many places in Alaska, temperatures there can be extreme, as they would be on February 2nd, when these 4 boys were inside a house playing, rambunctious playing in the house. Irene, the grandmother to 3 and mother to 1, was watching them that day, and it was her birthday. As boys do, they were getting restless. They wanted to go outside, and Irene, wanting to get them to have some exercise and play, rightly encouraged them to get outside in the great outdoors. But the weather was turning a little bit ugly. Storms were in the forecast. But Irene said later, they have to know how to be outside. They're tough Alaskan kids. There's always going to be a storm coming. Besides, the elders and their grandfather taught them to be prepared for the weather. This is teaching from their grandparents and mothers and fathers. So the 4 boys, Christopher, Frank, Ethan, and Trey, trudged outside to partake in one of the most popular winter hobbies we have in Alaska, snow machining. Snow machining is often referred to as snowmobiling by many Americans, but I'm going to call it by its proper name, snow machining. Due to the lack of road systems in our state, it also happens to be a primary mode of transportation during the winter months across dozens and dozens of villages throughout Alaska. After they went riding around the small village, the boys were going to call it a day when they spotted a fox. They spotted a fox, and like curious young boys do, the irresistible urge to chase this fox began, and they chased it out onto the tundra. And before they knew it, they lost the fox. The snow machine was now stuck in the snow, and they were lost in a white blizzard. They were lost. Chris, the 14-year-old, the oldest of the group, the leader, was determined to lift the snow machine free of the snow. He lifted so hard that later it was discovered that he suffered a hernia. This is one tough kid. Eventually, the machine unfortunately ran out of gas, and the young boys were miles and miles away from their village and lost. They began tracking through the deep snow in whiteout conditions in a direction that they thought was the way back home. At one point, one of the boys briefly took off his glove, which the wind promptly took away in the storm. Yet they continued, walking and walking into winds as high as 60 miles an hour and wind chills way, way below zero. After fighting the deep snow and whiteout conditions for 4 miles, Chris decided it was time to try to build a snow cave for shelter. Smart young man, knowing how to survive. They did it. They built a shelter out of snow, a hole for them to crawl into and escape some of these most brutal wind gusts. Now, a snow cave, Mr. President, is only used as a last resort, but this was the last resort, and these young boys knew it. So they crawled in, and they huddled, and they waited for a rescue. Back in the village, as you can imagine, the boys' family was getting frantic. They called out to the community to help search for them, and that's what people did. All throughout the community, they couldn't be found, and then it does happen in our state often. The Coast Guard, the National Guard, local search and rescue groups from neighboring villages were all activated. Alaskans throughout the state going to look for these 4 boys. It was all hands on deck. Irene and the mother of 3 of them, and one of the mothers of 3 of them, Karen, were heartsick. Hours and hours went by. The whole state was holding its breath. It had been over 24 hours. A cold night fell. Around 2 a.m., the search and rescue was called off. In the snow cave, however, these young, tough Alaskan boys continued to protect each other. Almost 20 miles away from home, they huddled. They tried to keep each other warm, to keep each other alive. Ethan didn't have a glove. Christopher was only wearing sweatpants. And they were particularly concerned for the 2-year-old, Trey. First one of them crawled on top of Trey, but they were afraid that might be too much for him. So they created a kind of crisscross barrier to keep this young 2-year-old alive and warm as best they could. The 8-year-old, Frank, refused to close his eyes throughout the night for fear of falling asleep and really never waking up. So he continuously stayed awake and poked the other boys throughout the night to keep them awake, which was successful. The next morning, the storm had cleared, the sun started to come up, and the search throughout the state with all these other Alaskans looking for these 4 boys continued. For hours and hours, the search teams kept their eyes peeled for anything unusual on the tundra. And about 1 hour before the sun was going to go down again, the next day, the search party from Scammon Bay, about 50 miles south, saw something. They knew how to read the tundra. They knew what a snowdrift would look like, and this one looked different. Then they saw movement. The search party investigated and came upon the 4 missing boys huddled and bundled together. Because it looked like just one big mass, at first they didn't think any of the boys were alive. And then they realized what was going on. They were protecting the baby. One of the rescuers, Herschel Sundown, told a reporter they were protecting Trey. The rescue team immediately got to work warming the boys up, and within 15 minutes, a Coast Guard helicopter, our brave men and women on the Coast Guard, always on the scene, quickly transported these boys after picking them up to a local hospital. Ethan, the 7-year-old, is now recovering from severe frostbite on his hands, but all the kids are back at school and doing well. The rescuer, Herschel Sundown, said, "Honestly, I don't know how they survived. The will to survive in these young boys was amazing. I have never seen anything like it." Irene, the grandmother of the 3 and mother of 1, is so very proud of them. If I were to get lost in Alaska, in the wilderness, I'd want to be with these 4 boys. That's what she said. Ms. President, so would I. She also asked for the prayers of the country and for Ethan and for his hand to heal, and that's starting to happen. These are the kind of young men and boys in Alaska that make us so unique, tough, resourceful, and they uplift us and they make us proud. They're the protectors of their lands, their homes, and, importantly, each other. So to the rescue crews, thank you again. Hard work, perseverance, risking your own lives for these young boys. And to Christopher, Frank, Ethan, and little 2-year-old Trey, thank you for your inspiration, for your ingenuity, your toughness, for being able to survive in the elements and looking out for each other. And thank you for staying alive and staying safe. And congratulations on being our Alaskans of the Week. I yield the floor.